Thank you very much for having invited me. I have no mic. I hope you hear me well. Okay? I certainly believe you have read many articles about the situation of the Jews in France, and you have quite an idea of the state of the situation. But I would like to show you a few figures that will give you an idea of the big change we've experienced from the 1990s until now with regard to the figures of anti-Semitic incidents. As you see, before the start of the second Intifada, we had, I would say, low to very low number of anti-Semitic actions in France. Most of them were threats, I would say the usual kind of threats you get from the traditional extreme right movement. We also got a few cases of arson back at the end of the 1970s, but this is nothing when compared to the big change in the situation when the second Intifada started. All of a sudden, in year 2000, the number of anti-Semitic incidents rose over 744 exactly. And what is more disturbing is that not only were those incidents far more serious than those in the previous period, but also the big change is that most of the perpetrators are not belonging to the extreme right. The French authorities, and I must say the Jewish community as well to a lesser extent, at first were quite reluctant to believe that such a change was possible. And we had a very hard time trying to adjust to this new pattern, because mostly we've lived with an important immigrant population, mostly from North Africa, Muslim population. They've been present in France since at least the end of the 1950s. But up until the start of the second Intifada, I wouldn't say that we had no incidents between the two communities. In fact, we had quite a few in 1967, at the time of the Six-Day War. But overall, the situation was quite quiet. We had no inter-communitary problems, at least not leading to physical assaults or serious incidents. And really, what is interesting here is that you see two things. First of all, each and every time something occurs in the Middle East opposing Israel to one of its enemies, whether it is Hamas or Hezbollah, we have a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents. Second, even when nothing serious happens in the Middle East, we have a level of anti-Semitic incidents which never goes below thrice as much as was used to be the case before the start of the second Intifada. Which means that even when nothing happens in the Middle East, the situation is quite serious. And we have incidents, I will not say every day, it depends on the place where you live. In Paris it's almost every day. But we have incidents every week, some of them serious, even when nothing appears, when nothing happens in the Middle East. So I'm not quite satisfied with the explanation that the number of incidents is related to what's happening in the Middle East. It is, in some way, because there are peaks, obviously. But the big change for us on an everyday basis, in our everyday lives, is that even when nothing comes into news from the Middle East, we're still in a very different situation than we used to be back 25 years ago. So, for example, in 2014, that was the last peak in the number of incidents with a correlation to what happened in the Middle East. There in the middle of the summer 2014, we reached an unprecedented peak, not only in the number, but also in the seriousness of the incidents. We had cases of arson. We had at least one case of a pro-Palestine demonstration on July 13th, I think, which ended in a huge mob of several hundred people going to attack the worshippers in a Paris synagogue. Well, happily enough, the police went to the scene quite rapidly and we had no casualties. But anyway, that's the first time in the memory of the Jewish community that a pro-Palestine demonstration ended up in such violence. Obviously, we have pro-Palestine demonstrations and they are totally legal, and there's no problem about that. We have one at least every week in Paris. Sometimes we have slogans which we do not like very much, but I mean that's a kind of political debate which is totally legitimate. But having a mob of, I would say, between 300 and 500 people, mostly youngsters, going to attack people into a synagogue was something we had never seen since the end of the Second World War. So, once again, this does not repeat. Up to this day, this did not repeat. And I would also like to explain that probably, unlike what you have heard on certain TV channels or in newspapers, we are not in a situation where every day we are in a kind of civil war with the Muslim population. And the situation is very different, not only from one city to another, but also between the different areas of Paris, for example. I happen to live in one neighborhood on the eastern side of Paris where everything is quiet. And my children were able to attend school without any problem. And this is a very mixed neighborhood with a huge Muslim population and a huge Jewish population. And on an everyday basis, there's no problem. And then, if I move up, let's say, half a mile from my location to another area, in the same district of Paris, I mean, I wouldn't go there and leave it, obviously, because the attitudes of the population, and not only the Muslim population, is quite different, and it's pretty much hostile. So it probably has to do with class, probably has to do with some part with ethnicity. It also has to do with politics and the attitude of the elected officials in this or that district on issues related to the Jews in Israel. And this is a very complex issue. You cannot say that today France is a country where the Jews cannot live. It's obviously totally false. We have a very thriving community life, and I would say that when I compare our communal life to what it used to be 20 or 25 years ago, it's obviously much more productive and much more fruitful than it used to be. We have many more synagogues, we have a huge networks of Jewish schools, and we also have many more community centers than a quarter century ago. We have 4 radio stations, 4 Jewish radio stations in Paris. In Paris we also have magazines, newspapers and so on. But there's this feeling of uneasiness which does not only come from the situation itself, from the number of incidents, but from the fact that both the conservative government of France and the social democratic government, which was in office at the time of the Second Intifada, were very, very slow in reacting to it, in adjusting to this new pattern. So the bodies of organized Jewry in France had to talk to them many, many times and saying, look here, we have a problem and you have to react. before they considered that the situation was so serious that it was a threat not only to the Jewish community, but to the French population as a whole and to the country. In other words, they certainly downplayed at that time, and they do not do this anymore, but they, until I would say the anti-Jewish shootings in Toulouse in 2012, yes, the French government certainly downplayed the role and significance of Muslim radical organizations, and this had a tremendous impact on the anti-terrorist policies. I do not say that they are not good, I do not say that they are not effective, but still, so much more could have been done before. If only the government and the authorities would have realized back in 2000 that something was happening that had not been foreseen by our security forces. And this is simply that for several decades, the radical Muslim organizations had been able and free to organize themselves, and were gaining new adepts, not a few hundred, not a few thousand, but certainly much more than that. And the result was this inability to understand that this problem with anti-Semitism would, first of all, grow, and second, give birth to the kind of terrorists that we've seen operating in 2014, and of course in 2015, which was the worst year in the recent history of France. Remember, in January we had this attack on the Charlie Hebdo newspaper. 2 days later we had this attack on the Jewish supermarket on the eastern side of Paris. And then, of course, we had the November 13th bombings, not only at the Bataclan, but at a lot of other neighboring places. Those bombings we will commemorate, 1 week from now. And contrary to what has been said, at the moment of the bombing, I must say that I have had access last week, just before departing, to the complete list of victims. Not only those dead and those wounded, but also those suffering from shock as a result of the attack. And the number of Jewish casualties is pretty much high. It was first said that there were no Jewish people deceased, and this was true. But when you look at the number of people who were badly injured and others who have a permanent psychological stress coming from this attack, the number of Jewish people involved is quite high. It's also interesting to go beyond those figures and see the breakdown of anti-Semitic incidents recorded over the last 3 years according to the place where they occurred. So it may be a little difficult to explain. In France, we have the basic administrative authority in France is the département. Well, I would say a département is a little bit less than a state. It's smaller than a state. It's bigger than a county. But it's the main administrative unit. So we have 99 départements in mainland France and the overseas territories, and each of them has a specific number, is designated by a specific number. So 75 is Paris, for example, and this is, you see here that the highest number of incidents took place in Paris. Those départements are the so-called banlieues, both on the northern, southern, and on all sides of Paris. And those are usually the places with the highest concentration of immigrant population, not only Muslim population, because before the Muslim population settled in those areas, back in the 1930s, the Jews also settled in those areas, and before them the Italian and Spanish and so on. Those are probably the most economically deprived areas around Paris. And as you see, the number of incidents is also quite high in those neighborhoods, despite the fact that most of the Jewish communities there, which were, say, very active from the start of the Jewish immigration from North Africa in at the beginning of the 1960s, up until the Second Intifada, we had very active Jewish communities all around Paris. And the situation has become so bad, obviously, that many of those who lived in those neighborhoods have left and settled in Paris proper, or moved to other areas, or have left France for quite a few thousand of them. But of course, the big problem for the Jewish community is that when you want to leave, let's say, Department number 93, which is probably the most, the place where the hostility against the Jews is the highest. It's also a place where housing is very cheap, where even working class Jewish families can live if they want to move to Paris or to a safer area. Of course, the problem is, can they afford it? And most of them don't. So we have smaller Jewish communities in the banlieue, but many of those Jews who grew up there simply cannot afford to move, which means that on an everyday basis, they have to face the present situation and wait for better law enforcement or for becoming more affluent and moving elsewhere. But what is really interesting you is that in several of those areas where a significant number of incidents took place, the Jewish population is very small. If you ever look at Department 59, for example, this is the Lille area. Lille is a big city, it's the biggest city in northern France. How many Jews are there in Lille? I would say less than 1,000. There's a synagogue. They hardly have a minyan every week, only for the high holidays. The Jewish community is so small that they have no visibility. I mean, you will never see any kind of communal life in this city, unless, of course, you belong to the community or you are aware through your acquaintances. But yet, the number of anti-Semitic incidents is quite high, and especially in the two cities in the vicinity of Lille, with a significant number of immigrants from North Africa, those cities of Roubaix and Tourcoing, as they have a majority, I would say, over 50% of the population comes from a Northern African Muslim background. So does it mean that the Muslim population is hostile to the Jews? The answer is no. You cannot say the Muslim community. You cannot speak of the Muslim population as I would say a community without any difference in religious observance and in the level of prejudice the people have against the Jews in Israel. If you want to have an idea of what the Muslim population really fears, you have to look at this graphic. One conservative think tank in France called Fondapol had a survey 2 years ago, and they decided to look into the attitudes of both the mainstream French population, the Muslim population, the sympathizers of the Front de Gauche, which is a political party left of the Social Democrats, and including the Communist Party, and the sympathizers of the National Front, the, some say, extreme right, radical right, political party. So they decided to ask the people they interviewed what they feel about 6 stereotypes usually associated with the Jews. You see them below, and basically what you see in the graphic is the proportion of those people belonging to either the Muslim population or the voters of the National Front, or is the number of the proportion of those who answered yes to those stereotypes. Okay? So the yellow line is the average level of anti-Semitic prejudice as measured by this battery of questions, and the level of prejudice in green is that of the Muslim respondents. The red one relates to the extreme left, and the brown one relates to the extreme right. So what you see very clearly is that the level of prejudice among those respondents who say they were Muslim is higher than the level of prejudice among those who say they would vote or consider voting for the extreme right National Front. Then comes the voters of the extreme left. But what you also have to know is that within the Muslim population, the attitudes were very different according to the level of religious observance. The most interesting result of this survey is that there is a direct correlation between the level of prejudice against the Jews and your level of observance as a Muslim. The level of observance was measured with several criteria: attending a mosque every week, not only going to the mosque once in a while, every week for the Friday prior, eating halal, and fasting in the month of Ramadan. So the survey was fantastic in that it clearly showed the huge gap in attitudes between this part of the Muslim population, who, I would say, is non-observant or is more or less culturally Muslim, but has no specific interest in religion, and those who are really into at least attending a mosque and having become closer to religion. And this was certainly the most disturbing result of this survey, not only because of the figures, but because this prejudice against the Jews among the Muslim population could be fought if the Muslim population had one communal organization we could talk to which the state could talk as a, I would say, as a partner. The Jewish community has several mainstream organizations, NGOs, and so on, which are well established. They have a very close relationship to the state and to the authorities. And if something goes wrong, the French government knows that it can go and meet with the chief rabbi or the president of what in the UK would be the Board of Deputies, and so on and so forth. But the Muslim community is so diverse and they are so unable to this day to build a common representative organization that is really a problem. If you want to, for example, set up an educational program to teach the Muslim kids about the Jews in Israel, and with the result, of course, of lowering the prejudices. And if you do not have any reliable organization you can talk to, it's obviously a problem. And I would say this is the biggest challenge the French state is now facing, trying to build up a really representative organization of French Muslims, both secular and observant. The fact that such an organization does not exist is because since the 1960s, all the succeeding French governments, whether they were conservative or left-wing, have made the very big mistake of saying, okay, most of those people will not stay in France, they are just coming here as guest workers, and on the day they retire, they will go back. They will, as we used to say, go back to their native countries. No way. If you live somewhere for 30 years or more and you work there, and you buy a house, and your children grew up in French society and went to university, you will just stay. And eventually you will become a French citizen. But we thought that they would remain foreigners, so we did not take care of what they would become. We did not build mosques. We did not try to build any organization, as I said. And we said, okay, the majority of them come from Algeria, so let the Algerian government take care of them. Others, 500,000, come from Morocco. Let the Moroccan government take care of them. Others, less than 500,000, come from Tunisia. Let's take the Tunisian government take care of those people. That means appointing imams and sending them to France to serve the mosques, appointing teachers who teach the children the Arabic language, even in public schools. So when the government in Morocco is not fundamentalist, this is okay. When the government in Tunisia was secular, that was okay. But what happens if someday the political change in those countries bring an Islamist government, and the people who are appointed to serve the Algerian mosques belong to the Islamic Salvation Front, and we just say, okay, you pay for them, you appoint them, you're free to do so. So this is obviously one of the problems the French government is now trying to tackle. I do not know what the result will be, but nevertheless, in the campaign for the 2017 presidential election, which has already started, those issues are really at the core of the political debate. And of course, they have an immediate impact on the Jewish community. So I think I will stop here and just let you ask any question you may have about the situation.